The Treaty of Versailles, one of the most controversial treaties in history. The diplomacy that will end World War I, but will also be the beginning of many new problems for Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary and was assassinated on June 28, 1914. The Austrian government assumed it was Serbia who organized and executed the assassination, and saw this as an opportunity to regain their previous control over Serbia. This was the main event that led to the beginning of World War I. The war was fought between two major alliances of countries, including the Allied powers and the Central powers. The Allied powers consisted of France, Britain, Russia, Italy, Japan, and the United States, who later joined into the war. The Central powers were made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The war lasted roughly 4 to 5 years, but eventually the Central powers were defeated. By the end of World War I, all of Europe was devastated and Germany was defeated. The people of Germany were starving, and millions were dead. The country had spent all of its money on the war, and they were terribly in debt. After Germany's defeat, Britain and France held peace conferences to decide what they wanted to happen to Europe. Both Britain and France were extremely upset because even though they had won the war had all the same effects on their countries as it did on Germany. When creating the Treaty of Versailles, the Allied powers agreed to make it as harsh as possible on Germany. The Allied powers used war guilt to force Germany to take all the blame for the war, and to convince everyone else that World War I was entirely Germany's fault. The treaty imposed heavy reparations on Germany, and they were forced to pay 132 billion marks, roughly $442 billion, to Britain and France, even though they were already extremely poor. In addition, Germany is forced to give up 13% of its lands to France, Poland, and the League of Nations. This was absolutely humiliating for Germany, since it went from such a huge, powerful empire to a small, defeated country. The treaty also put harsh military restrictions on Germany. They were only allowed to have an army of 100,000 men, their air force was entirely banned, and they were only allowed 6 ships in their navy. All of this caused Germany to feel extremely vulnerable, considering how powerless they've become. Germany obviously resented every part of the treaty, but still signed it. Why? If Germany did not sign the treaty, the war would have resumed, and they would have been absolutely defeated for the second time, and the consequences would have been much worse for them. So eventually, the Allied powers and Germany signed the treaty, and all of the restrictions were put into effect. President of the United States Woodrow Wilson disagreed with the harsh punishment on Germany. The USA had not been involved in the war as long as Britain and France had been, and did not receive the amount of damage that the other two countries were struggling with. So he believed the war was not entirely Germany's fault, and they should not be punished as if it was. His idea was to create the League of Nations, which he believed would prevent another world war. An excerpt from Wilson's League of Nations speech in 1919 reads, "All the nations that have power that can be mobilized are going to be members of this league, including the United States. And what do they unite for? They enter into a solemn promise to one another that they will never use their power against one another for aggression, that they will never impair the territorial integrity of a neighbor, that they will never interfere with the political independence of a neighbor, that they will abide by the principle that great populations are entitled to determine their own destiny, and that they will not interfere with that destiny." Wilson believed the League of Nations would be a coalition of countries that protect the sovereignty of countries around the world, and that the League would be necessary for any peace to last between the nations of the world. He also believed the League would help Germany not to be entirely destroyed by the treaty, and possibly help Germany avoid having all the blame for the war put on them. From the beginning, the Treaty of Versailles caused many problems all across Germany, but also sparked anger and hate in many German people. This is part of the cause that would allow Adolf Hitler to rise to power. Germany had been in an awful state and had a massive economic depression that caused a countless amount of more problems that impacted this country. 6 million Germans were unemployed, and people started to become desperate. The population became drawn to right-wing nationalists who wanted to completely disregard the Treaty of Versailles. These nationalists believed that they had not lost the war, but were instead betrayed by this treaty, and the Jewish people who encouraged the punishments on Germany. The people of Germany believed they needed a strong leader to help them recover from everything they had gone through, and Hitler was this leader in their eyes. He claimed he was going to solve all the economic problems Germany had, and restore their military, air force, and their navy. He also convinced Germans to follow him by saying he would get back to Europe and the Jewish people for ruining their country. He was very firm in his opinion that Germany was the victim, and every other country wanted to reduce Germany's power to practically nothing. He revealed to the German people that the treaty was a rather hostile approach to the peace that Europe was trying to contain. He was telling Germany everything they had wanted to hear throughout the whole war and post-war, and people practically worshipped him for it. He was exactly who the German people wanted to rule their country, and who they believed could restore their country's power. Woodrow Wilson's plan for the League of Nations will eventually fail, as Hitler rises to power and World War II begins. The people of Germany felt lied to after Hitler started another war, rather than just simply solving their problems like he claimed he was going to. The Treaty of Versailles would eventually be seen as the foundation of one of the darkest times in history. The treaty was originally put into place to avoid any further conflicts between countries, but ironically was one of the major causes of a second war that would be more drastic and violent than the first. The Treaty of Versailles is one of the biggest and most important treaties in history, as it ended a world war, but was the reason for another to begin.